at our friends at the Institute of Meditation and Psychotherapy for all they've done to support us in the program, and to all of you for being willing to spend some time together this evening looking at this fascinating issue of the self in the context of the practice of self-compassion. This is a topic that's been of some interest to both Chris and I for some time. As he will tell you, we've started talking about it many years ago, and it remains a topic of great interest. When he first started talking about self-compassion years and years ago, I, as a scholar of Buddhism, got a little nervous. I said, well, you sure you want to use the word self here? Because of course, in Buddhist thought, that's a very subtle concept, very subtle idea, and it has to be handled carefully. But it's also the case that that the practice and the theme of self-compassion has evolved considerably over the last decade or so, and it remains a topic of great interest. I come to this not as a psychologist, but as a scholar of Buddhist studies. I am currently the professor at Lesley University, running their graduate program in mindfulness studies. Yes, you can get a master's degree in mindfulness studies these days at Lesley University. And this program really started because Chris and I talked about this just a few months ago. One of the aspects of our program, we have a week-long residency in January when all of our students come together, and we invite a guest lecturer. And Chris was gracious enough to agree to come and talk to us about self-compassion. In preparation for that, I gave a talk to the students about a Buddhist reflection on the concept of self-compassion. And out of that, an interesting exchange occurred between Chris and I. And we thought afterwards that it would be a really good idea to maybe continue that conversation and maybe share it more broadly with all of you. So that's how this came about. Chris?
Yeah, and Andy came up with the title, Mindful Non-Self Compassion. And when he said that, I thought, oh, that's perfect. And so it became the title of this workshop. Yeah, so again, I echo everything Andy said, thanking the friends and faculty at IMP and also Fiona for allowing this to happen. Mostly, I'd like to thank everybody calling from different parts of the world. I know at least one friend from Mexico and Germany, and I think that people from all over through the graces of the internet. So really happy to spend these 3 hours together, and thank you for cutting out time in your own schedule for this. And so self-compassion is actually a subtle concept as well, just like self is a subtle concept, as Andy said. And it is best understood through direct experience, of course. So I just like to lead us in, like I say, a 3-minute arriving practice, even what we call a soft landing practice, dropping into the present moment softly by intentionally adding a little bit of warmth to our awareness. So with your permission, we'll just do that for a few minutes together right now. So if you'd like to do so, please find a comfortable position. And if you like, you can allow your eyes to close partially or fully. And just give yourself permission to listen to the sounds in the room. Just allowing yourself to be in the midst of sound in this moment. And then in your mind's eye, finding yourself in the room where you are right now. That is to say, your body in the room. And just as you might greet somebody else, a friend, a neighbor, a relative, seeing if you can offer yourself an inner smile of welcome. Hi there, I see you. Welcome into this moment. As we all know so well how to welcome others, just taking a moment to welcome this one too. And perhaps even inclining your awareness toward this one as you would toward a good friend. In other words, you're not just saying hi, but you're even saying hi with your heart. Hi there. And then allowing your awareness to drop into your body and taking a moment to feel the sensations in the physical body right now. And if it makes sense to you, to feel your emotional heart. What emotions are in your body at this time? So what stands out the most, either in terms of physical sensations or emotions? What speaks to you right now? And if it's a pleasant sensation, seeing if you can allow it to be and maybe even take a moment to appreciate or savor that experience. And if it's an unpleasant experience, seeing if you can allow your heart to soften a little, allowing yourself to be moved a little by the experience, as you might if a young child had some discomfort or uneasiness. And taking a moment also to remember that no matter what you're feeling in this moment, either as a physical sensation or as an emotion, that this is part of the human experience, that actually in this very moment, though you might be focused on your own experience, that it's actually shared by many other people, even many other people who are right now in this workshop. That in fact, right now, you're not alone. Just taking a moment to savor that we are actually in a community right now. And that even though the situation or the details of what we're feeling differs greatly from one person to another, the immediate experience can be quite similar. And lastly, is there anything that you need to hear at the time like this? If a good friend were to whisper something into your ear, such as, I'm here for you, I love you, I understand, or encouragement, like, you can do this. What would you like to hear right now? And if you like, just taking a moment to allow those words to roll through your mind. Allow them to echo through your mind. Giving yourself permission to allow these words to be part of your experience right now. And then beginning to release the practice. And when it feels right to you, to slowly open your eyes. So this little practice actually had the three components of self-compassion as articulated by Kristen Neff. First, mindfulness. Second, common humanity. And third, a little bit of self-kindness. So that was a little taste. Thank you. Andy?
Thanks, Chris. Let me just let you know what the timetable is this evening. We have about 3 hours together from 6 to 9 o'clock Eastern time. Wherever you are, it's probably different. After this 15-minute introduction, I'm going to speak for 45 minutes on sort of a Buddhist reflection on the concept of self and non-self compassion. Then we'll take a short break, 5 minutes. Then Chris will speak for 45 minutes, sharing with us his thoughts and experience with self-compassion. We'll take another 5-minute break after that. And then Chris and I will engage in some open discussion between the two of us for about 20 minutes that you all can listen in on. And then for the final 45 minutes of our session together, it'll be an open forum and you can all make comments, ask questions, and participate however you wish. And then we'll wrap up at about 9 o'clock.
Perfect. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so before I go any further, I'd just like to situate myself identity-wise. My pronouns are he, him, his, and my other identities, white, male, middle class, heteronormative, partnered, they all tend to be mainstream in the USA, and therefore I've also experienced a lot of privilege. I'm acutely aware that this has also led to certain gaps in understanding. So just to say that I/we are committed to discovering gaps in our understanding, to being open to others, pointing them out, and also to creating as much as possible an inclusive learning environment in this workshop. And also I'd like to just say that I'm speaking from Cambridge, Massachusetts in the United States, which is on the ancestral land of the Massachusetts people. And now I'd like to share my screen. So Andy and I go back quite a while, at least to the early 1990s, long before I knew anything about self-compassion. And here's a photo of Andy from 2007. And we were on a tricycle magazine pilgrimage to sites of the Buddha's life on the plains of the Ganges. And the especially cool thing at the time was hearing from Andy what the Buddha actually said in these particular places 2,500 years earlier. And what the photo you're now looking at, this was a boat near Varanasi on the Ganges. And I also had the privilege in that moment of putting my father's ashes in the Ganges. My father had lived in India for 9 years when he was a young man. And while on that trip, I spoke with Andy and many other people about self-compassion, including fellow pilgrims, as well as Buddhist nuns and monks, particularly in Dharamsala when we visited His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I should probably add that most of the monastics were horrified by the term self-compassion. But during this time, I filled a whole legal pad with notes for the book on self-compassion that I had previously contracted with Guilford Press to write, The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion, and that came out two years later. So therefore, Andrew and also the journey had a really important impact on the trajectory of self-compassion training and the MSc program in particular that we have today, and that we will be teaching now together 14 years later. So let me show you another picture of Andy. Here we go. Andy, where is that location? I think that's Bodh Gaya, the top left image. What do you think?
Likely enough, yeah.
Yeah. And who's that guy driving the bus?
Yeah, I drove the bus throughout the whole tour.
Yeah.
Most of you know what driving in North India is like. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And when he got tired of the bus, of course, he tried an elephant. So there we have it. So Andy, I would love for you to now take some time to share your thoughts on the topic, what's the self in early Buddhist psychology and how the self is constructed and deconstructed.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
And I'm going to share your slides.
Because of some of my technical limitations, I've sent my slides into Chris and he is sharing them for me. So Chris, I'll raise my finger when we move from one slide to another, okay?
Okay.
This I just have to say, because you'd mentioned India, is a picture from that trip. One of my favorites. This is sunset from Vulture's Peak. And I love it because this very silhouette is the same silhouette that the Buddha would have seen 2,500 years ago as he sat there and watched the sun go down. So all traditions, including Buddhism, are adaptable. And it's important for them to be able to evolve and to adapt to changing circumstances. At the same time, there are aspects of their original way of expressing themselves that may hold information that can get lost in some adaptations. And I think it's important to make sure that whatever we can is preserved from the original insights, the original genius, if you will, of the Buddha. I call this non-self-compassion because you're all familiar with the fact that the doctrine of non-self in Buddhism is quite central to it. But non-self is a compromise from what's often called no self. You know, what I want to try to indicate here is that it's not a binary, that either the self exists or the self does not exist, that actually it's more having to do with a subtler interpretation of what we mean by self. So the question of the moment is, really, is this new emerging and very powerfully effective practice of mindful self-compassion, is it preserving in some way essential insights into the nature of the self? Might it be distorting them in some way? And how can we best understand the integration of ancient and modern ideas? So my starting place in all of this, on the next slide, Chris, is looking at sort of the classical meditation manual in the Theravada Buddhist tradition. I need to say, those of you who don't know me, I'm a scholar of early Buddhism. So my inspiration and interest is in the historical Buddha, what he said and left behind. And I'm not addressing, you know, the 2,500 years or 2,000 years at least of evolved tradition. So one of the great commentators of the early tradition is Buddhaghosa, and he wrote this book, The Path of Purification, quite some time after the time of the Buddha. This is almost 1,000 years later, 900 years later. But when you turn to the chapter on the Brahma Viharas, which I'll mention in a moment, when you turn to the chapter that talks about compassion, that talks about loving kindness, we encounter this phrase. And he gives instructions on how to practice loving kindness, metta. And he says, first, you should it be developed only towards myself. May I be happy and free from suffering. May I keep myself free from enmity, affliction, anxiety, and live happily. And we're all familiar with this. You know, most of you probably have practiced metta or loving kindness meditation. And most of you have started with these instructions. Let's begin by having some self-love, some self-compassion. Next, Chris. But I got worried because immediately after that, he says on the top left here, if that is so, does it not conflict with what is said in the texts? For there's no mention of any development of it towards oneself in what is said in the early texts. In other words, Buddhaghosa is telling us that the Buddha himself, during his lifetime, did not teach that Brahmavihara practice should begin with oneself, that it was entirely an outward focused practice. So that's worrying. That's a place to look. You know, why might that be? And how does the adaptation affect things? And I've just given some random quotes here. Buddhaghosa mentions the first two on the left, where passages from the tradition that talks about giving kindness to all beings with some elaboration. And there are many, many other places. I just took a handful of them here, but there are probably at least a dozen or more passages that I can come up with that talk about extending loving kindness and compassion to all beings in one form or another. The most comprehensive one here, of course, from the Metta Sutta over on the right here. Whatever living beings exist, whether without exception, whether weak or strong, whether tall and large, or middle-sized or short, whether very subtle or very gross, whether visible or invisible, dwelling far away or not far away, whether born already or not yet born, may all beings be happy in themselves. So this is pretty comprehensive, but it's not mentioning who? Myself. On the next slide, we see sort of this idea expanded further. This first box on the left is sort of the classical formula, if you will, of the Brahmaviharas, the practices of loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. And this is a stock passage that happens in probably dozens of places throughout the text, all in the same language. With a mind accompanied by loving kindness, one abides suffusing the first direction, the second, the third, the fourth, that is north, south, east, and west. Those are the four directions. Thus also above and below and all around, everywhere, in every way. One abides suffusing everyone in the world with this mind accompanied by loving kindness. And then there are various versions of this, various adaptations of this, various applications of this in actual practice. Sometimes we're directed to go systematically through the 10 directions, first to the east and west, north and south, but also the intermediary directions, northeast, northwest, and so forth, above, below, and all around. Sometimes we're asked to go more geographically. In the bottom right, may the beings in this dwelling, in these two dwellings, in these 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 dwellings, on one street, on half the village, the whole village, and the whole district, the kingdom, and then the 10 directions, and so on to this entire world sphere. The idea is that you begin with a sort of kernel of feeling care and benevolence towards one person, and then gradually expand it out, either through different groups of people or through different directions. Other groups of people include, you know, all women, all men, all noble ones and not noble ones, used in the sense of those who are following the Buddhist teachings and are not. All human beings, all in states of loss, that is, people reborn in more unfortunate realms than we live in. Most standard is these 5 persons. You begin with a very dear person, and then go to a dear person, then a neutral person, someone who's not dear, is the literal word, it means someone with antipathy, and then even to hostile persons. So that's another way that you can expand. And then just to really drive the point home that this is an outward facing focus is this image in the top right box of a trumpeter who systematically blows their horn in every direction, just as if a mighty trumpeter were with little difficulty to make a proclamation to the four directions. So by this liberation of the mind through the development of loving kindness, one sets the example, leaving nothing untouched. So that's the idea. I think we've driven it home with all these passages, the notion that it's really meant to expand outward from one's own mind and heart and go in all directions. But nowhere in all of this textual material do we find explicitly mention of doing it for oneself. Now, you could argue that, yourself is included in all beings. If they're going to encompass everything, then that includes you. So we're not being specifically excluded, but they don't mention it in particular. Now, in the next slide, staying with Buddhaghosa, we find him answering his question, does this conflict with the classical teaching or not? And he says it doesn't. Why not? Because one develops in this way, I am happy, just as I want to be happy and dread pain, as I want to live and not die, so do other beings too. So what he's saying is that you're using yourself as a template, making oneself an example, then desire for other beings' welfare and happiness arises in a person. In other words, he's saying that you begin with yourself because, of course, we all naturally love ourselves. And it gets us in touch with, okay, maybe I should extend this out to other people, starting with this visceral experience of loving oneself. And then he quotes this famous passage in this other text, which is well known and often cited. Having traversed all quarters with the mind, one finds none anywhere dearer than oneself. Likewise, each person holds themselves most dear, hence one who loves himself should not harm others. But now we have to ask the question, is it the case that we all naturally love ourselves? Also, I'll pass over this because it's a technicality, but he's actually translating the same phrase in two different ways. May I be happy at the beginning, and now I am happy. This verb can take either form, either spelling. So he's exploiting a grammatical ambiguity here. But the main point is does it apply to us today to say that the way that we can get in touch with what it feels like to love all beings or even other people is rooted in our own personal experience of self-love? Many of you will be familiar with the well-known story where when Western meditation teachers were talking to classical Tibetan scholars about this issue, they raised the question, well, what about self-hate? What about when people don't love themselves? And it turns out that in our modern Western society, there are a lot of people who don't automatically and naturally love themselves. So I'm not sure that this explanation that Buddhaghosa is giving here is entirely convincing. And even does it argue for the need for loving oneself? If we all naturally automatically love ourselves, why would we practice the deliberate act of loving kindness for ourselves? One of the things we're often told is that the reason we start with ourselves because it's necessary. We need to learn how to love ourselves before we can love others. And that also I would hold as a question. Is that the case? Some people, it seems to be the other way around, that they find it more easy to love other people and have compassion for other people and find it difficult to turn that on themselves. So as often is the case, one size perhaps does not fit all. So putting the matter more plainly, is there a chance that we're distorting this here? That maybe this entire practice of loving kindness and compassion is intended to get us out of ourselves, out of a focus on our own perspective, and really train us and teach us how to be expansive towards others. In other words, might we be taking something that is really intended for one sort of practice and turning it around for another sort of application, which may be undermining in some way the original intent. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just raising it as a question. And I think I'm happy to say that by the end of our talk, we'll get free of that. Let's go forward a couple more here now, please, Chris. Okay. So in order to look at this question, there are two things we have to explore in some detail. One is the Brahma Viharas in general and the specific dynamics of how those work and how we work with them. And then the second thing is the Buddhist notion of self and how the self is understood, how it gets constructed in some circumstances and not in others, and understand that dynamic. Once we understand the Brahma Viharas and the teaching about how compassion works, and once we understand the classical Buddhist teachings about self and non-self, we'll be in a better position, I think, to answer these core questions we've raised. So again, many of you are familiar with the Brahma Viharas. It's a word that simply means Brahma is a kind of a generic word for something exalted or sublime or raised up, something that you'd find in heaven among the angels and the Brahmas. Vihara is just a way of living, a way of holding oneself. So these are four mental states: loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. These are emotions within the human heart. These are mental factors within the human mind. And mind and heart are often interchangeable words in this tradition. So I'll sometimes use one or the other or both synonymously. Now, what's important here to recognize is that these Brahma Viharas, these are mental factors. They're qualities of one's own mind. They're not some sort of field that you generate that goes out and affects other people, you know. There are some Indian traditions that think that way, that have that idea that you can generate certain, you know, almost spiritual fields of kindness or goodwill that radiate out into the world and then have an effect on all those that it touch. But that's not the case here. Buddhist thought and practice is about transforming one's own mind by purifying it. Yes, thinking kindly of people and benevolently and with goodwill improves one's own mind. You know, that there are sort of toxic qualities that we can have. We've inherited greed, hatred, and delusion. We can be pretty nasty and hurtful and selfish and hateful. Or we can also be very altruistic, very benevolent. And this is a practice of isolating or distinguishing these four particular qualities of mind, and then coming up with practices that will help us develop them, cultivate them, is the words that they use. And the goal for this is not to transform others. When we say, I wish that person, may you be happy, may you be well, it's not like in the Western tradition where you might make a prayer or a blessing, where you're calling on a higher power to help protect that person or to contribute to their welfare. When you're saying, may you be happy, you're using the other person as an object or a target of the emotion. But basically, you're trying to fill your own heart and mind, moment after moment after moment, with this benevolent attitude, with this very beautiful emotional state. And that has a purifying effect on your own mind. That doesn't mean that the people out there are irrelevant, but thinking of different targets, so to speak, of one's loving kindness is a way of sort of supporting and sustaining that state within your own heart and mind. But all of these require taking something as an object. That's why we have all those different phrases and all those different directions and categories of people and so forth. So when you're thinking of loving kindness, it's directing it at a particular person or a group of people or to all persons. Even when it's directional, going north, south, east, and west, you're not sort of trying to send kindness to the woods on the east or the ocean on the west. You're addressing it to all the beings, all the living beings that live in those various other regions. So it's fundamentally a relational practice. where you're trying to extend this emotion to others. Now, what is about this dynamic that is of particular interest to the issue of self-compassion? Well, first of all, we need to see ourselves as an object. That's the problem that I always had when I first started doing this practice. When they say, okay, now direct your attention and have loving kindness for yourself, I'm wondering, what is that self that's being targeted? What exactly am I sending or projecting or sharing or suffusing uh, this loving kindness with? Because, you know, there's so many different layers to the self. There's my wonderful self and my terrible self and my angry self and my loving self and so forth. That, you know, the self as a concept. See, in each of these cases, when you think of another person, a friendly person or a hostile person, you're using a mental image. You're basically creating a mental object. And that will now become the target of this loving kindness and compassion. And the reason you keep repeating that phrase over and over is it acts as a platform that will sustain this emotion towards one object after another. What you're trying to do is change the concept or the conceptual label of what you're feeling kindness for while maintaining the source, the generation of that emotion of kindness, moment after moment after moment. So when we turn, if you will, the loving kindness or the compassion or even the appreciative joy on ourselves, what exactly is it? You know, so much of the mindfulness practice is so precise, you know, moment by moment. There's this sensation arising and passing. There's this movement of the foot, lifting, moving, placing. There's an endless stream of very precise micro sensations that you're being mindful and aware of. But when you turn it to yourself, what exactly is the target? That's one question. The other thing is that loving kindness is universally extended to all beings. But compassion, if you see the proximate cause here, it's seeing hopelessness in those overwhelmed by suffering. In other words, loving kindness morphs into compassion when you see suffering. And the same thing with appreciative joy. The loving kindness morphs into appreciative joy when you see someone well off, someone happy, someone succeeding. In other words, compassion and appreciative joy are specific forms of loving kindness being universal, but compassion only occurs when you experience someone as suffering or in pain. And then it's the natural sort of a trembling of the heart. And as you see here, the characteristic is an impulse to allay the suffering. You want to heal them. You want them to be better. You want to help because you care. But it requires that you see a suffering object. So if we're turning self-compassion, if we're turning compassion on ourselves, then we need to view ourselves in some way as suffering and then sustain that moment after moment. Um, and as we're going to see, self can be a view. Self is not something that actually exists. It's an idea we have about ourselves. So let's turn to that next, Chris. So the next slide, I want to go over some basics about the whole notion of self and how it works in Buddhist thought. I'm sorry this is a complex slide. I'll try to make it easy. But basically, they see the person as consisting of these 5 aggregates on the left. Material form, consciousness, feeling, tone, perception, and formations. The mind and body is a process. It's not a thing. It's a verb. It's not a noun. It's something that's happening. It's not something that exists. And it has these 5 different functions. And the functions really are functioning. You know, does the material body really exist? Well, yeah, it really exists. So starting with material form, the kind of foundation of every event and process in the mind, it's just the early Buddhists being accepting of the basic material basis of all life. It's respecting the world of chemistry and biology and neuroscience to say that there is some sort of materiality out of which our experience is the emergent property. Either as in early Buddhism, consciousness arises out of the contact between the sense objects and the sense organs, or neuroscience, consciousness is an emergent property that arises from the activity of the neurons. In later Buddhism and other traditions, consciousness is viewed a little bit more maybe like the background radiation of the world, of the universe. But either way, you have this materiality and mentality, this mind and body, that one is not dependent on the other, they're interdependent with one another. Consciousness is simply awareness, the ability to know or be aware of something. Next, we have a feeling tone. Every single mind moment, it feels good or it feels bad, or it's neutral. We can't tell the difference. Not the emotions, feeling in the sense of emotion, but feeling simply in the sense of a hedonic valence. Perception is that cognitive apparatus that we have to make sense of the world around us, to learn language and use concepts and so forth. And then this so-called formation, this fifth aggregate, is really where the heart of our emotional life is. We have certain responses. We have to respond to what's happening. Whatever object comes up, we feel what it feels like. We decide what it is cognitively. We put a label on it, and then we respond to it. And just to simplify, we have two primary kinds of responses. Those that are rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. In other words, all the sort of anger, fear, cruelty kind of responses. We're capable of those emotions. And we have a whole set of very benevolent, very wholesome and healthy and helpful responses, rooted in kindness and generosity, compassion, wisdom, and so forth. Now, the thing is, these events are really occurring moment after moment after moment. The mind and body are pulsing, just like everything else in the universe. And they're arising and passing events. And in between them, there's sort of downtime. Now, because these events are happening, each one of these provides a basis for a view of self. Starting with material form, we think that I'm the occupant, the inhabitant of the body. Wherever the body goes, I seem to go with it. Consciousness is the essence. I'm the one who is aware. My awareness is the essence of who I am. For feeling tone, I'm the beneficiary of the pleasure and I'm the victim of the pain. I'm the one who feels all that. The artiste, the perception, there's all this narration going on and the creation of meaning. I'm the person who's telling the story, who's expressing myself through language and dance and music and so forth. And then because we act in the world and their decisions are made, actions come out of those decisions, and then you become the person who sort of inherits the consequences of those actions. So what this all boils down to in the bottom line here, these five aggregates arise and fall together every moment. They kind of come together. They're an episode of activity, which then goes to rest. Then all the neurons fire again, it goes to rest and so forth. This happens very, very rapidly. So like a strobe light, it feels like a continuous process, but it's actually a very episodic one. All of these things are interdependent. How you perceive things is going to be based on how you feel. It's going to be your response is going to be based on your awareness and on and on. And it's absolutely different every single moment. Now, the bottom line for our view of self is that we take ourselves to be the owner of all that. You see all this activity, that's mine. This body, it's my body. These feelings, my feelings. These views and opinions, that's me. And the phrase that comes up dozens, if not scores or hundreds of times in the Pali text is this phrase, I am this is mine, this is myself. This feeling tone, that's me. This idea, that's me. This thought, that's me. We're in the habit of basically projecting ownership onto what's basically a process of cause and effect, a natural part of the natural world. The only part that's not part of that part of the natural world is this idea that we're somehow separate, we're somehow different, we're somehow other than these five aggregates. We're the sum total of that, or something inside it, or like a jewel in a box, or a scent in a flower, or the self is like the shadow of a tree, or the color of a flame. There's all these metaphors they have for understanding this. But the point is that self is a construction. It's an idea. It's a view. And if you see on the five aggregate model here, way over on the left, there's a little self in red there. It's a view. That's where the self exists. This isn't all a self. The self is a little idea we have, a little label we put on this is all mine. And one of the phrases they use a lot in the text is becoming a self, that you create the me, you create the I, you create the sense that it's mine. So that's the basic idea of how self works. Now, on the next slide, we're going to see where this all goes wrong. How does this lead to suffering? Basically, the self is constructed, and this is all following the teachings of dependent origination, this sort of 12-fold model of mind and body interaction. It's basically saying that the self may or may not be constructed in any given moment. The self as a view, as an attitude, as an orientation, is something that occurs in some circumstances and not in others. And we all know what it feels like to be very self-conscious and very self-absorbed, and also what it feels like to have a temporary loss of self, being lost in the beauty of the moment, or the dance, or the music, or there's lots of ways that we can lose ourselves. And it's actually often a very peak experience. So how does the self actually get constructed? Well, it gets constructed by craving, desire. Now you see I've got an arrow coming out of the formations, the red part, the red states and the blue states here. The red states of greed, hatred, and delusion mean that when we experience pleasure and pain because of the hedonic response, we want the pleasure to continue. We want the pain to stop. This wanting is creating a sense of there being a difference. It's not this is what's happening. It's I want it to be different. And in order to want it to be different, you have to be a person. The desire is creating the person who likes or doesn't like what's happening, wants or doesn't want what's happening. And the craving automatically leads to grasping. Grasping is a way of behaving under the influence of this craving, where there's certain things you want to hold on to and there's certain things you want to push away. And this pushing and pulling is kind of creating this sense of a self. You are now becoming a self. That is, a self is generated when a person is out of sync with what's happening, when they basically want it to be different. Then you're creating the person who wants something different than what's happening. And once you've created a self, now you can suffer, because suffering is only something that is done by a self. Desire is something done by itself, and suffering is done by a self. Only a self can have a desire. Rocks and trees and tables and chairs don't have desire. They're not a self. But a person, we start talking about a being as someone who prefers something over something else, who wants it to be different. And so craving is what's creating this person who can then suffer, because suffering also is not something that rocks and trees and tables and chairs do. They don't suffer because they don't have the self who wants something to be different. Every moment when you want things to be different, you don't like what's happening, you don't want what's happening, or you're really chasing something, that's the heart of suffering. And this, of course, is the Buddha's key insight into the noble truths. The second noble truth is that a craving is the cause of suffering. But the self is acting as the intermediary. See, craving causes suffering because the self is created and then is experiencing the suffering. And of course, the third noble truth says that if you end the craving, you won't suffer. So suffering consists of the self wanting things to be other than they are. I want more of what feels good. I want what feels bad to go away. This is okay, that's not okay. In the classical definition of mindfulness, and John Kabat-Zinn used the word not judgmentally here, non-judgmentally is mindfulness, but when we're in this judgment. Okay, next slide. That's when it all goes wrong. How does it all go right? Well, this is where mindfulness comes in, and this is where the Brahma-viharas come in. Because there are moments when we are not constructing the self. The mindfulness replaces the greed or the hatred. See, in every mind moment, there can be only one formation, one emotional response at a time. You can't love and hate in the same moment. You know, you can rapidly switch between them. You can love in some ways and hate in others the same object. But in one moment of experience, there's only going to be the benevolent compassion or the fear or the anger or the resistance or the hatred or whatever, not both. So mindfulness is not craving, not wanting, and not wanting. Mindfulness is equanimity, is an essential ingredient of mindfulness. It's simply being with what's happening without favoring or opposing anything, without wanting it to be something other than it is. And when there's no longer the craving in that moment, it's replaced by mindfulness instead, then the whole series of selfing doesn't happen. There's no grasping, there's no becoming a self, there's no suffering. What this suggests is that a moment of mindfulness is actually a moment of non-self. Now, again, this is strange for us because we think of self as a thing that exists and how could I be without a self? But when you start thinking about self as an attitude that you create that is either present or not present, then we begin to see that moments when we want things differently, we're selfing and not feeling okay, and times when we're simply adapting to or following along with what's already happening, we're not struggling. And so there's no suffering in those moments. And the same thing is happening here with the Brahma-viharas. Loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, equanimity, they are all helpful, healthy mental states. All of them take the place of craving. See, when you have loving kindness for, all beings, you're not craving their happiness or craving, them to be happy. That would be a distortion of the mindfulness, of the loving kindness practice. But the intention is there. The quality of mind is one of benevolence, of friendliness, of care. And that is sustained when you take different objects. Now, you see in the top of this diagram, I tried to show that under perception, there's this little thought bubble here, this little cloud, because perception is using words and concepts and images and so forth to take an object. I mean, just using one from our list, the object might be a very dear person or a dear person or a neutral person. And then as the perception takes a different object, the heart, the emotional response, the sort of attitude that one has towards those people is maintained as one of these Brahma-viharas. Now, it can be tricky, you move from the neutral person to the hostile person, that heart might blip out all of a sudden and turn red, and maybe you're not feeling so benevolent towards so-and-so, but you learn to come back, and eventually you may succeed at that. So this practice involves then, whatever objects one takes, one maintains a healthy emotional attitude toward. So I can think of anything, and I'm trying to maintain this one of these Brahma-viharas or mindfulness. No longer being driven by desire does not mean that one no longer acts in the world. One thing I hear all the time, well, if you're okay with the way things are, then you're just going to put up with social injustice and bullying and all of that. It doesn't mean that. By all means, do what's appropriate to change the world for the better and to help alleviate suffering and grow in wisdom in various ways. But here they're talking about the quality of the heart with which you do it. So you can do what's appropriate, but you're motivated by generosity and kindness instead of by any of the other toxic emotions. Okay, next. Now, putting these things together, I see this as part of it, the difference between giving and receiving. As we know, the self is an important concept in modern psychology. It's important for someone to have a strong self. The self goes through stages of development, and it's important that these all go smoothly. And in order for that to go smoothly, a person needs to receive adequate care. They need to receive sustenance and nurture, love. Babies need to be loved, for healthy development. And the self can get damaged by not receiving adequately the love that it needs, by not receiving loving kindness, not receiving compassion, not receiving appreciative joy as it grows up. That can do serious damage. We know that. Now, one way of healing a self that's been damaged in that way is to provide those things. One of the best ways to help someone who needs help is to care for them, is to be compassionate towards them and so forth. So it's natural to think of the Brahma Viharas as a way of giving the self what it needs to thrive. If you've been devoid or deficient in the amount of loving kindness or compassion that you've received in your life, and it would benefit you to get more of that, and here's a way to sort of self-generate it, then why not? That makes sense. But here's the difficulty. If I understand these Brahma Viharas correctly, in their classical sense, it's a practice of giving, not of receiving. So thinking of others and wishing the well of others is what the whole practice is oriented towards. Loving kindness turns to compassion when you see a suffering person. It turns to appreciative joy when you see someone succeed. But you need to see that other person for that to happen. On the other hand, it's also true that giving love and kindness, giving compassion and appreciative joy is inherently healing. In other words, these are beneficial human emotions, so it's always good to generate them. The question is, when you're practicing self-compassion, are you benefiting from the giving of it or from the receiving of it? And this is the point that I'd like to try to make. I have just a few minutes left, so I'll try to wrap it up. It's universally good. This text on the right, if just for the moment, the time of a finger snap, a person produces a thought of loving kindness or compassion or appreciative joy, then they develop it and give attention to it, and then that's a good thing. How much more so if they actually can cultivate it? So giving compassion and so forth to oneself will also be healing, as long as one takes care to do it in a way that, on the one hand, you're not engaging in the selfing process that we defined earlier, that you're not doing it out of an unhealthy or an unwholesome emotion for caring for oneself. In other words, we keep the blue states going, but don't slip into the red states while you're doing the practice. Then it's a healthy thing. You also want to be careful not to create an elaborate image of a wounded self. One of the texts that talks about the target of compassion gives a very detailed and gruesome description of someone having this terrible suffering situation. It's not going to be healthy for you to cultivate a mental image of yourself as badly hurt and wounded while you're sustaining this practice. It'll be counterproductive. And then finally, to hold oneself as an object lightly and reflexively. What it may mean by reflexively is, obviously in Buddhism, one talked about the external and the internal. Directing attention internal is not unusual, but you don't want to create an elaborate view of yourself in the process, because self is ultimately a mistaken view. And finally, the last slide, I'm trying to offer some concluding thoughts. Can loving kindness and compassion meditations be seen as a way for the self to receive care? Yes, but when other people are kind and caring to you, then we can receive that. So it's good for everybody else to practice loving kindness and compassion and direct it towards you. because then their behaviors and the tone of voice and everything will be more beneficial. But no, in the sense that when we practice self-compassion, it's the giving that's healing, not the receiving. So when we are generating compassion for ourselves, it's a really good and healing thing. But what's doing that healing work is the giving. The fact that it turns around and comes back to yourself is, not the critical piece here. You could have the same compassion for anybody. You might as well do it for yourself. So the practice of self-compassion, it's always healthy to cultivate that. It always purifies your own heart, regardless of what the target is, particular person or group of people, or yourself. You might as well be in the target range of that. So I would conclude by saying the practice of self-compassion is a skillful means suitable for our own time and culture. Buddhism has this notion that the teachings are adapted skillfully as a way of conveying the core teachings. If generating compassion is inherently a healing thing in Buddhist thought, which it is, and if our culture is such that we honor the self as something being in need of receiving it, then it's okay to generate loving kindness for yourself. But what is doing the healing is not that you are now the recipient of all this kindness and compassion, but the fact that you are generating it. That's what's doing the healing. That's what's really good for it. So is the Buddhist conception of the self an obstacle to practicing self-compassion? Not if it's understood carefully. And the final thought I'd simply ask is this question about further study. This is just a hypothesis that I'm putting out as I understand the classical texts. What if there's a lot of studies going on. What if you have practicing compassion directed towards others, one group doing that, another group practicing compassion only for themselves, and then compare the outcomes, compare the functions of these two groups. If my hypothesis is correct, that it's the giving rather than the receiving that's transformative, then there would be little difference between the two groups. All right, that's all I have to say on the matter for now. Thank you very much. And I suggest a 5-minute break, and then we turn things over to my colleague, Chris.
Perfect. Thank you, Andy. See everybody in 5. May I also add that we're going to have a good 45 minutes of Q&A at the end and opportunity to share reflections. So if you have any thoughts that you don't want to miss, please put them in the chat as we go along, and then we will pick from the chat to respond. And people will also have a chance to ask their questions directly. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, folks. So Andy, thank you so much for your talk. I just love the way your mind works, and I really appreciate the extra thought that you gave into exploring really on the foundation of a psychology that was created 2,500 years ago, exploring how this construct, which has basically been around with a scientific background only for the last 20 years. So to be integrating them in a creative way, even with an empirical proposal to explore, how that, whether that might, make sense empirically or not. It's just a lot of fun, and it reminds me of when many talks that we had when we were in India. So much gratitude for your talk, and also for having been my teacher in this regard for so long. I also think that many people on this call probably are thinking, gosh, I wish I visited the different pilgrimage sites of the Buddha with you and could hear what the Buddha actually said on those very sites. And so I would like to tell them, because you never would, because you're such a humble guy, that actually in December, Tricycle Magazine is going to do this again. And Andy has been invited to lead a group to all these different sites this coming December. So if you're interested, you can contact Andy or Tricycle Magazine. So in the next 45 minutes, I'd like to talk about self-compassion and how non-self is actually woven throughout the MSc curriculum, in theory and in practice. And in a sense, I would like to reveal the hidden curriculum of MSc, or the invisible mechanics of MSc, because the self-compassion practices were actually designed to reduce the tyranny of the separate self. And so when we talk about the self in self-compassion, it's really an effort to accomplish this task as skillfully as possible, the task of reducing the tyranny of self. I should perhaps say just a little bit about how I got interested in self-compassion. So I'd been practicing mindfulness for a couple decades, and at the same time as I was a licensed clinical psychologist, and throughout those 2 decades, I suffered from public speaking anxiety. And I tried everything, including making space for anxiety and so forth, and nothing helped. Until I learned from Sharon Salzberg, loving kindness for myself. In other words, what Buddhaghosa said the Buddha did not say, but seemed to make sense at the time, It really worked for me. And really, I had been avoiding practicing loving kindness for myself because 2 things: I preferred practicing with awareness, and I really didn't like using words with meaning in meditation. It always seemed kind of clunky to me. Which is really kind of ironic, because I was a clinical psychologist throughout this whole time, in which words and meaningful words are our medium of exchange. But I just didn't want to do that with myself. But we had a big conference coming up at Harvard Medical School, and I just, after really practicing on a retreat for the first time for 4 months before this retreat, and then every day prior to, 4 months before the conference, started practicing every day loving kindness meditation, primarily for myself, especially when I thought about this conference and was panic-stricken, that made all the difference. So when I got up to speak in front of this group of 600 people at Harvard Medical School, the usual terror arose with me, but there was a new voice in the back of my mind saying, oh, may you be safe, may you be peaceful, and may you be healthy. And then the most amazing thing happened, and that is when I looked at the audience looked really beautiful to me. Because, as anybody knows who's had public speaking anxiety, the audience is usually the enemy because they can judge you. But through some crazy alchemy, I looked over at the audience with these words, supportive words in the back of my mind toward myself, and everybody looked beautiful. And actually the words that were coming up inside of me, oh, may everybody be safe, may everybody be peaceful. So this was my first experience of how quickly self-compassion could turn into compassion for others. And I learned a ton of other things. One thing I learned is that my public speaking anxiety was actually not an anxiety disorder, it was a shame disorder. I was afraid of being judged as incompetent or fraudulent because I'm trembling like a leaf trying to talk about mindfulness. But most importantly, what I learned is that sometimes when emotions are intense and disturbing enough, it's really hard to hold the emotion in spacious awareness, i.e. be mindful, until we hold ourselves. Sometimes we first have to hold ourselves as a sentient being in order to calm, comfort, reassure ourselves and so forth before we're capable of actually holding an experience. And this is particularly relevant for people working in the mental health field because we are continuously interacting with people who are struggling with intense and disturbing emotions. So I discovered firsthand the power of self-compassion through public speaking anxiety and after having learned loving kindness meditation for myself. So that was in 2006. The pilgrimage with Andrew was in 2007. And then in 2008, I met Kristen Neff, and who in 2003 had actually operationalized self-compassion and made the first scale of measuring self-compassion, which has been used in most of the 4,000 articles in the academic literature. So Kristen, I'm a clinician, Kristen's a scientist, and so we joined forces, and starting in 2010, we began to teach the Mindful Self-Compassion program. And I think there are a lot of people on this call who have taken this program and who are teachers of MSC. There are now 3,000 trained teachers of mindful self-compassion, and well over 200,000 people have taken the training. There's an enormous interest in this. And I think simply because self-compassion works, in the same way it really revolutionized my mindfulness practice, a lot of people are noticing this as well. So I'm going to unpack that story a little bit. I should say that Kristen also learned about self-compassion through her Buddhist practice. She learned about it listening to a talk at a Thich Nhat Hanh Center in Berkeley, California. So as Buddhist practitioners, we've really been acutely aware of what a fiction a separate self is, and it causes untold suffering. And Andy has many times, I didn't hear him actually say those words today, but he's often said that not only is self an ongoing construction project or deconstruction construction project, but it's also a habit of mind. And anything we do to strengthen this habit, which is usually what we call selfing, leads to more suffering. And anything we do to soften the habit of selfing reduces suffering. And in my view, self-compassion, paradoxically, shows us how to be with painful experience without additional suffering. In other words, as Andy was talking about, with equanimity, which Andy has also said that mindfulness has many meanings, but in the early Buddhist context, it was most closely associated with mindfulness. It was most closely associated with equanimity, even more than moment-to-moment awareness. If I'm incorrect about that, Andy, perhaps you can point that out. Anyhow, since everybody, probably most everyone in this workshop knows about mindfulness, I'd like to start by talking about self-compassion by contrasting it with mindfulness. So it should be said that when mindfulness and self-compassion are in full bloom and we're suffering, right? Andy's very clear that you can only really have compassion when you're suffering. So let's assume we're suffering and mindfulness is in full bloom. Inevitably, self-compassion will be in full bloom as well, right? There would be this quality of metta or loving kindness blended with suffering, that's compassion. However, most of the time, our mindfulness or our self-compassion are partial. And then we need to actually strategically introduce perhaps one element or the other into our practice. You know, Andy said very optimistically that when loving kindness meets suffering, it turns into compassion. But usually what happens when loving kindness meets suffering, or quite often, it does not turn it into compassion. That we're lucky when we can sustain the kindness. Often it turns into aversion and disgust and fear and so forth and so on. But when it does stay loving, when loving kindness meets suffering and stays loving, then we have compassion. So how to do that, right? So anyhow, mindfulness can be considered a loving awareness of moment-to-moment experience, whereas compassion is loving awareness of the experiencer. Compassion always has a sentient being as an object, even if the sentient being is, in an absolute sense, a fiction, you know, constructed of various aggregates. This is the nature of the practice in a relative sense. And mindfulness asks, what am I experiencing? Compassion asks, what do I need? This is a different question, right? Complementary, but different. What's really interesting is how mindfulness and self-compassion regulate emotion. Mindfulness primarily regulates emotion through attention regulation, right? What we're thinking about, what we're paying attention to, and how we pay attention to it. Self-compassion regulates emotion through affiliation, in particular through care and connection, right? The same way we were emotionally regulated when we were very young by another human being who would give us care and connection, that regulated our emotions, right? So we've been doing this for a long, long time. What people tend not to know is that they can actually do that for themselves. And another way of talking about the complementarity is that mindfulness is like space and compassion is like warmth, and space creates warmth. You know, the more we can be with something with equanimity, there's a kind of quality of affection that arises. I think Andy might even say this from an early Buddhist perspective, you know? But also warmth, space creates warmth, but also warmth creates space. In other words, when we are actually compassionate, we are disentangled, okay? So, in my view, the main problem that people have with the term self-compassion, the main problem with self-compassion is the term itself. You know, Andy also said, you know, that word self is so subtle, we can't just bandy it around and slap it onto compassion. And what does that mean, you know? But the other problem is that, you know, self is associated with untold suffering. You know, the more separate we feel, the more we suffer, right? So, but in particular, the term self-compassion has kind of a cringe factor because self is usually associated with selfishness, and compassion often makes people feel weak. But one thing we know is that actually the research shows that it's really quite the opposite. People who are self-compassionate actually are more compassionate toward others. People who learn self-compassion become more compassionate toward others, right? Andy asked the question, do you need to be compassionate toward yourself in order to be compassionate toward others? The research actually shows no, that's not true. In fact, the majority of us are more compassionate toward others than ourselves. The vast majority, 78%. But when we learn self-compassion, we become more compassionate toward others, much as I had experienced when I first learned this. Some people are concerned that self-compassion will make them weak. The research shows, if nothing else, that self-compassion is a powerful factor for emotional resilience and coping, helps people, recover more quickly from trauma and, illness. And terrible things happen when terrible things happen. Some people are concerned self-compassion will make them kind of self-pitying. And we actually see that when people are self-compassionate, they ruminate less. They're actually more aware of other people in their environment. Some people worry that if they're self-compassionate, they'll be self-indulgent, seeking pleasure only. But we find that people who are self-compassionate, they actually are better able to balance long-term and short-term pleasure and long-term benefit. In other words, they eat better, they sleep when they're tired, they exercise more, and things like that. The major concern that people have is that self-compassion will make us less motivated. And the research shows exactly the opposite. In other words, people who are self-compassionate, they are actually more motivated to achieve their goals. Their standards are just as high. People high in self-compassion and low in self-compassion, their standards are equally high, but people with self-compassion are more motivated to achieve their goals because they're motivating themselves with encouragement rather than with criticism. So this is all to say that we don't need to be afraid of self-compassion from an empirical point of view. And in fact, maybe we should be afraid of not having self-compassion, because these 4,000 studies basically show that self-compassion is good for you. Why would you not want to do it? In other words, actually, self-compassion does not increase suffering, it decreases suffering, right? So it increases in well-being of all sorts, happiness, life satisfaction, coping, emotional resilience, emotional intelligence. A study just came out 2 months ago, people who are high in self-compassion, less likely to get bored. Mark Leary at Duke University said that the research is boring because self-compassion is associated with just about every positive measure of psychological well-being that we have. Anyhow, it's also associated with reductions in anxiety, depression, stress, shame, suicide, and so forth. Improved physical health, right? Immune functioning improves, healthier behaviors, and also more satisfying relationships. People who are high in self-compassion are more collaborative, less aggressive, more compassionate. So, in total, there are, as I said, this little graph goes up to 2020, but now in 2022, there are 4,000 articles in Google Scholar that have self-compassion in the title. So there are actually even more studies than that that include self-compassion as an outcome variable. The main finding is that self-compassion is good for you, particularly for emotional resilience. And some people wonder, how does it work? Well, generally speaking, when people are self-compassionate, they have less fear. In other words, their sympathetic nervous system decreases. They also have a more sense of safety. An increase in heart rate variability is very reliable when people are self-compassionate. And it also appears to activate the prefrontal area, which is kind of executive functioning, which can downregulate unnecessary stress and fear. So the question is, what is self-compassion? So an informal definition is treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding as we'd treat a good friend. So if somebody has difficulty being self-compassionate, all you have to do is ask them, how would you treat a friend in exactly the same situation as you, who feels just like you? What would you say? What would you do? This is a friend who you care about, right? People quite readily can figure that out. What would I say? What would I say or do? And then the next question is obvious. Could you do some of this for yourself, right? So this is how we actually find a way to self-compassion. So Buddhaghosa might have said, start with yourself. The irony is that nowadays, because of what Andy said, many of us actually don't like ourselves. We have to start with somebody else in order to find a way back to ourselves, right? So the first direction of loving kindness for most of us is someone else. And then once the energy or the attitude or the intention or the inclination of heart of loving kindness or compassion gets activated, then we slip ourselves in. It's kind of like we warm up the bed and then we slip ourselves in. We actually need to kind of trick ourselves into self-compassion. Yeah. So Kristen's definition, formal definition, has these three components. One is mindfulness versus being over-identified or entangled in our emotions or centered on ourselves. Mindfulness versus over-identification, self-kindness versus self-criticism, and a sense of common humanity versus isolation or loneliness. And this isn't all there is to self-compassion. This is really important to know. If a building is burning down, is it compassionate to just kind of stand on the other side of the road and look at it and say, I feel bad for those people? No, we got to run in and do something, right? So self-compassion sometimes is bold, compassion and self-compassion sometimes is bold and fierce. For self-compassion, sometimes we have to say no to harm, right? Non-harm is the foundation of compassion. It's the foundation of self-compassion. Sometimes we need to say yes and feed ourselves. Sometimes we need to say, you can do it, and motivate ourselves. This is all in the yang side of things, the action in the world side of compassion and self-compassion. The yin side is comforting, reassuring, soothing, validating, and so forth. So we need to have a broad view of self-compassion, that it's not just tenderness, right? Can self-compassion be learned? So easy to learn self-compassion. Get a dog, do a little forest bathing, walk in the woods with appreciation and savoring. Learn mindfulness, you'll learn self-compassion. Take an MSc course, you'll learn self-compassion. Apropos what Andy was saying, actually, if you behave compassionately toward others, you will become more self-compassionate. And if you become more self-compassionate, you will probably increase your compassion for others. Or you can also learn yoga. Be in psychotherapy. Increases in self-compassion are very closely correlated with improvements in psychotherapy. So you should really think of self-compassion as a broad concept, and there are multiple avenues for learning self-compassion. So now I'd like to get to the core of what we're about here, and that is mindful non-self compassion. So in particular, I'd like to offer three theoretical considerations and then three practical skills that are embedded in the MSc training for your consideration, okay? So the first one is melting the self. So some mindfulness practitioners worry that self-compassion will strengthen the sense of a rigid, separate self and thereby increase our suffering. Actually, both mindfulness and self-compassion reduce and soften the sense of self, but in different ways. So mindfulness dismantles the self by breaking up the self into moment-to-moment experience, or as Andy was describing, into the constituent parts of selfing, right? Compassion, so mindfulness dismantles the self. compassion melts the self in the warmth of kindness and in the heat of suffering. The sense of self melts. And we all know this actually since birth, when we're very upset and a compassionate person helps us to calm down, we become less focused on ourselves and we begin to be able to look outside of ourselves and see the causes and conditions that led to our situation. But we can only do that after we've been held for a little while. So why not learn how to hold ourselves in the same way? Why would that be anything other than melting the self? And we can actually see this when a person is immersed in shame. Shame and self-compassion are inversely related. When a person is immersed in shame and they learn self-compassion, they actually become less self-absorbed and they can begin to look at what happened and even make amends. Shame itself is not helpful for repair, actually, because we're so self-absorbed, right? And then there's the question, if we comfort ourselves when we suffer, won't we bypass important life lessons such as impermanence, the truth of suffering, and selflessness? In other words, may we lose this opportunity for wisdom if we comfort ourselves when we suffer. And it's true that self-compassion can be used to sugarcoat difficult experience and hamper learning, but any practice can be misused. And that's why in the mindful self-compassion program, we first need to open to suffering with mindful awareness before comforting ourselves with compassion. Some people wonder, how much suffering should we allow into our lives before engaging compassion? And it really depends in part on what the practitioner wants to achieve, whether they want to achieve wisdom or compassion. So a wisdom practitioner may wish to linger longer with suffering in order to learn insight into the impermanence of suffering. So for example, at a retreat, maybe you'll hold that really painful position a little bit longer so that pain just becomes pulses. And then you merge with those pulses and then it doesn't even hurt anymore. That's called wisdom, right? So if you want to grow in wisdom, that's one approach, but a compassion practitioner may actually prefer to cultivate a tender, compassionate heart that moves quickly and spontaneously to alleviate suffering. In other words, when you have an ache or a pain in meditation, shift your position, right? One is not more right than the other. It depends on your objective. Okay, so this is the way MSC is focused on melting the self, right? Self-compassion also requires common humanity. So common humanity is one of the three components of self-compassion. And when Kristen came up with this definition, she actually was going to use the term interbeing from Thich Nhat Hanh. But she decided not to because she thought this would be a bit of a mouthful for scientists. But statistically, the three components of self-compassion, which means mindfulness and common humanity and kindness, are very closely correlated. And that means that common humanity actually correlates a lot with mindfulness. When we are truly mindful, i.e. open to our experience, we see that it's not only our experience, right? And when we're truly kind to ourselves, we actually experience a more global kindness. So what this means is we can't really be kind to ourselves or mindful without a sense of common humanity. And common humanity in the early Buddhist sense is really insight into interdependence, into dependent origination, co-arising, connection, that sort of thing. And this also makes sense probably from personal experience, because the opposite of common humanity is isolation and loneliness. And when we feel all alone in our suffering, it really tends to magnify our suffering. You know, sometimes, like when somebody is feeling really bad, even suicidal, just knowing that there is one person in the world who knows how I feel often helps a person to survive to another day, right? This is the power of not feeling alone. And when people go up onto a bridge and they're going to jump off, if some compassionate bystander could make that person feel not so alone, they're likely to step off the bridge. Research shows that loneliness is associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety, suicidality, as well as sleep disorders, diabetes, high blood pressure, substance abuse, and self-compassion practice decreases loneliness. Okay, so common humanity is a key part of this, and common humanity is closely is really, in a sense, a practical opposite to selfing, right? It's the opposite. Another really important concept in MSC is what we call stages of progress. And I first heard this from Bill Morgan, who's on the faculty of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy. Bill actually wrote his dissertation on this. He used somewhat different words to describe the stages of progress. But this is really important, particularly in view of selfing and these stages of progress are actually a decreasing in selfing. And we can actually measure progress in self-compassion by a diminution of selfing. But we do this by measuring a refinement of intention. So that basically means learning to practice self-compassion for its own sake, not as in an effort to manipulate our moment-to-moment experience. So everybody starts self-compassion because they want to feel better, right? This is what Andy described as craving and grasping. We don't do anything except because we want to feel better, you know? So this is very natural. And this first phase of self-compassion practice is full of hope. And sometimes we actually have an epiphany like, oh my goodness gracious. You know, like my own mother at 83 years old said to me, you know, Chris, I didn't know that I could love myself. I didn't know it. Like nobody told her in 83 years that she could love herself. This was an epiphany, right? So often we have an epiphany like this, and this comes from this striving, from this effort. But the next phase is disillusionment. And just like in any romantic relationship, something pops the bubble. We look at the person and say, oh, wow, you know, you're not who I thought you were. You're just kind of a person. And the same thing happens in self-compassion practice. After the epiphany, we often say, wait a minute, I still feel the same way I always did. I'm still the same person. Self-compassion is not working. That's called disillusionment. This is actually progress, okay? Because we're starting to disabuse ourselves of grasping, right? We're broken. That's a good thing, right? And then the last phase is radical acceptance. And this really means embracing our experience and ourselves just as we are, okay? So how do we progress toward radical acceptance? Mostly we do less striving for our experience to be other than it is, okay? Andy used the same language, you know, a craving for your experience to be other than it is. Radical acceptance and this whole pathway is decreasing the wish for our experience to be other than it is. And radical acceptance, to use a very simple metaphor, is just imagine you had a child with the flu. The child's 10 years old. Everyone at school has the flu. Your child just got the flu. It lasts 5 days. So there you are, there your child is. What are you going to do? You're going to take care of the child. You're going to give the child, a cool towel. You'll feed them their favorite foods, to the best of your ability. You'll be really nice to this child. You'll be compassionate. Why? Are you doing this because you think, oh, if I'm really kind to this child, the child's flu will last for 1 day? No, it's 5 days. You're down for the count, the long haul. Similarly, all of us have the flu, and it's a lifelong flu, and it's called suffering. We all suffer, but as soon as we suffer, immediately we wish it were other than it is. And with that very tiny wish, Andy would say, emerges a self. How can we keep ourselves in that moment from generating this monstrosity called the self again and again and again? We do this with compassion, right? The same way a parent's heart may just melt toward a child with the flu, so also when we suffer, we can learn, we can develop a new habit, first response, kindness toward ourselves when we suffer, like, oh, this hurts. Oh, we can do this. And when we do this, we have dismantled the habit of selfing, and we've created a habit of compassion. Okay, so these are the stages of progress. And the best way to summarize these two stages, this last stage, is what we call the central paradox of self-compassion. So there's a mindfulness one for the mindful, and there's a self-compassion one. The mindful paradox is when we suffer, we practice not to feel better, but because we feel bad. Okay, that's just like the parent with the child with the flu. We're not trying to fix anything, manipulate anything. Self-compassion is not a slick new way of manipulating our experience, right? We're not craving, right? We're not grasping. Somebody once said it's a little bit like the reaction of the eyelid to a dry eye. We don't say, oh, now I should close my eye. It just goes, can our compassion be that natural? When we do that, we will not be generating more and more suffering and more selfing, right? And then there's a self-compassion component or side of the paradox, and that is when we suffer, we practice not to perfect ourselves, right? Most of us are in this crazy, lifelong, subtle aggression of the self called self-improvement. When we suffer, we practice not to perfect ourselves, but to embrace our imperfections. So let's see how much more time I have here. And then, okay, I think until, I have another 12 minutes, and then we're going to have another short break. So in this remaining time, I would like to talk about the 3 core meditations of the MSc program and how they're actually designed to reduce selfing in very interesting ways, okay? So the first is affectionate breathing. It's basic breath meditation, but it has 2 little twists to it. The first is the focus of awareness is actually the rhythm of the breathing. In other words, giving ourselves the opportunity to feel the rhythmic rocking motion of the breathing. Okay, it's still the breath, but it's the sense of being internally rocked and caressed by the breathing. And in this way, as the meditator, we're actually not so much trying to concentrate, trying to meditate, trying to focus. We're actually not the doer. We are the recipient of the meditation. We are actually being held by the breath. And when we are held by the breath, the sense of self can relax. And then we even invite people in this practice that if it feels right to you, you can even let go of the idea of meditating and be your breath, become your breath, be your breath, be breathing. No self, just breathing. These are explicit instructions in affectionate breathing, right? Liberating ourselves from the idea of a self who meditates and liberating ourselves from the idea that there is a subject and an object. Being, breathing, freedom. So many people have said this is a liberating way of practicing. Liberating from what? Liberating from self, okay? Then we have the second meditation is loving kindness for ourselves. And Andy was basically saying, okay, who's talking to whom? Okay, so what we like to say is it doesn't matter, because loving kindness and compassion is omnidirectional. It is an attitude. It's an intention. It's an energy. It's an inclination of heart, right? If you increase compassion for others, you will become more self-compassionate, and vice versa. The object doesn't matter. Choose whatever object you like. And sometimes, most commonly, it is the sense of self that identifies with the physical body. That's the object. The body is the object, or the sense of self that identifies with it. We don't have to be shy about this. It's an object, but the object is not the point. The energy is the point, right? So we can choose whatever object, and also we can choose a part of ourselves. One powerful way of practicing loving kindness meditation is to choose a part of ourselves that might have been hurt at 10 years old and directing kindness to that part of ourselves. Very powerful transformational experience. Finally getting the love that you've craved your whole life since you were 10, right? And then who is doing the practice, right? So some people say, if they're in the Zen tradition or if they practice internal family systems or so forth, they say, well, it's my true self, but you don't have to do that. That might not be your cosmology. You can say, well, it's just a compassionate aspect of myself. That's very easy to consider. We have compassionate aspects. The compassionate part of myself or my true self. It doesn't matter. What matters is the energy. But the most important thing about this is that, again, when we practice loving kindness meditation, we are the recipient of the practice, okay? It's like taking a warm bath. The water surrounds us and does all the work. The words do all the work. We are receiving. We are giving up the idea of being the doer. We're giving up self. And that is also an incredibly liberating experience. Last meditation is giving and receiving compassion. So Andy was talking about this, who's the giver, who's the receiver. And this is a derivation from Tonglen, which was attributed to the Indian Buddhist teacher Atisha, like 1,500 years ago. Absolutely brilliant, crazy brilliant meditation. But it's based on the cosmology that we have a kind of fundamental compassionate self, and we breathe in suffering, it gets transformed in our true nature, and then we breathe out compassion. If we don't have this cosmology, we're out of luck, So we adapted it such that we breathe in compassion for ourselves and out compassion for others. In for me, out for you. And we find just the right balance so that it doesn't cause stress. And the fundamental idea behind Tonglen is that it actually dissipates the sense of self. And breathing compassion in and out does exactly the same thing. It allows us to nourish ourselves, nourish others, and dissolves the sense of separate self. Okay, and Another really important aspect to this is parts psychology. And so Thanissaro Bhikkhu, right, a scholar of early Buddhist psychology like Andy may or may not agree with this, what I'm about to read, but he says, there are many different ideas of you in your mind, each with its own agenda. Each of these yous is a member of the committee of the mind. That's why the mind is less like a single mind and more like an unruly throng of people, lots of voices, lots of different opinions about what you should do. Isn't it true? When we want to exercise, yeah, part of you wants to exercise, part doesn't, right? And Tan Jeff goes on to say, some members of the committee are open and honest about the assumptions underlying their central desires. Others are a little more obscure and devious. And this is because each committee member is like a politician with its own supporters and strategies for satisfying desires. Some of the committee members are idealistic and honorable, others less so. Actually, in my view, they're all very honorable, but that's another subject. So the Minds Committee is less like a communion of saints planning a charity event and more like a corrupt city council with a balance of power constantly shifting between the different factions and deals made in back rooms. Anyhow, this idea of parts is fundamentally compassionate. We have wounded parts, we have whole parts, old parts, young parts. Harry Stack Sullivan, the psychoanalyst, said, for all I know, every human being has as many personalities as they have interpersonal relations. So actually, when we're engulfed in shame, we're usually convinced that we're fatally flawed. But it really just means that we're absorbed in a part of us that's carrying a burden and we can't see the rest. So when we feel shame, for example, we think I'm bad. No. Actually, when we feel shame, it's a burden that a part of us is carrying. And shame splits us into parts. Trauma splits us into parts. And then we hide from ourselves as we hide from others, right? And sometimes these parts are hidden away because they're just too overwhelmed at the time and they couldn't process what was happening. So the experience and who we were at the time goes into hiding. So therefore, a skillful way of practicing self-compassion is not only to a general sense of self, but specifically to parts of ourselves from different times in our lives. And so what I'm describing is the really deeply compassionate approach to therapy by my friend Dick Schwartz, the founder of Internal Family Systems. And what's interesting about this is that Dick actually believes that these parts have ontological reality, that they existed even before birth. So these are not constructions, right? The epistemology of early Buddhism, and also mostly of mindfulness as we practice it, definitely of MSC, is constructivist, that the self is always being constructed, but actually everything that we think and do is the result of an infinite intersection of forces and events in our lives. This is a constructivist view, right? So the epistemology and mindfulness in particular is that the self, but also the selves, are a continual reconstruction project. So even though this philosophy of parts and the philosophy of constructivism are philosophically incompatible, my experience is that it still is very useful to work with parts. And this is also what we call skillful means. Just like the whole self-compassion project is skillful means, perhaps for some people. So also working with parts is skillful means, especially when a person has a really clear image or sense of a part who speaks in a clear voice. In that case, accepting the reality of a part is a therapeutic necessity, even if it's conceptually at odds with constructivism, right? To think of it as a solid unit is a therapeutic necessity. And the more trauma a person has, the more they're likely actually to have encapsulated a chunk of their experience into a part. And to be helpful, we must assume that this part is real. And we should not be shy about offering kindness to that part. And we do this in the MSc program, and it's actually pretty interesting because we're changing a little bit. You know, we do this practice called motivating ourselves with compassion, where we become mindful of inner criticism and we exchange it with inner kindness. But what we've found is that many people find it much easier to explore the inner critic, like a part, rather than criticism, from the perspective of a compassionate self, rather than exploring inner kindness, right? So we're working with skillful means. What does it actually take to soften that rigid sense of self that has been frozen in the past, and that is actually not even allowing us to see things as they are and be with things as they are? Now, the very last thing I'd like to say in the few moments I have left is about equanimity. So in MSc, we rely on mindfulness practices to create space for compassion to arise. Because otherwise, if we didn't ground this in mindfulness, self-compassion is likely to become sugar coating, is likely to become saccharine, or even used as a defense, you know, like taking a handful of sugar and throwing it at suffering to make it go away. Equanimity protects us from that. So equanimity refers to maintaining a mental balance in the midst of opposites, such as pleasure, pain, success, failure, joy, sorrow, and so forth. And mindfulness either is mostly about equanimity or it leads to equanimity, which then leads to wisdom. So mindfulness gives us the space to see the complex interdependent causes and conditions that make our lives as they are. And also gives us the wisdom to see that we have some control, but not total control. So equanimity is not cold detachment, but it rises from a deep understanding of the transient, interdependent nature of reality. And this is the last thing I'll say. In MSc, we have a practice to help caregivers with compassion fatigue, or what we call empathy fatigue. And practitioners begin when they're caring for somebody and find themselves starting to hate that person or be frustrated with that person or want that person just to disappear, as most of us do at some point, because caregiving can be really hard. When we find that basically our heart is no longer in it, the question is, how can we nourish ourselves? How can we actually stay in connection and maintain loving kindness and compassion, right? So the practices that we offer in the MSc program are starting with giving and receiving compassion with the breath, breathing in for me and out for you, in for me and out for you, allowing every in-breath to nourish the self, i.e. the identification with the body, every out-breath to nourish that other sentient being. You need a sentient being to practice compassion. So we the main reason why people experience compassion fatigue is because they've actually stopped paying attention to their own needs. So this is a way of actually seeing and saying, hi, I see you, I love you, in the midst of caregiving, but it's not enough. We also need equanimity. So the equanimity phrase that we use, adapted for caregiving, which comes straight out of early Buddhist texts, is to think as we're practicing. Everyone is on their own life journey. Now, this isn't straight out of Buddhism. This is a transliteration. Everyone is on their own life journey. I am not the cause of this person's suffering, nor is it entirely in my power to take it away, no matter how much I wish I could. Moments like these are difficult to bear, yet I may still try to help if I can. So this gives us space, perspective. It helps us to disentangle emotionally from the person we're caring about. It gives us just a little room in order to see that we too need compassion in order to remain compassionate. So in this way, compassion always needs to be leavened with equanimity in order to remain compassionate. Okay, we need mindfulness. We need equanimity in order to sustain compassion, both for ourselves and for others. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say now. It's 6 minutes after the hour. I'd like to invite you to do two things. Please write down all your questions or comments if you haven't already, because we're going to have a lot of time to speak. I do have a 7-minute, lovely 7-minute video of Mathieu Ricard, which he recorded last week about self-compassion. So if we run out of things to discuss with each other, I can always show the video, but mostly I'd really love to hear from you, what you're thinking about all this. Love to hear from Andy as well. So let's take another 5-minute break. Then Andy and I will have a bit of a sharing, and maybe for 15 or 20 minutes, and then the floor is open, and we'll go until the hour. So we'll have another 53 minutes from now. Thank you all for your attention. Hello, Andy. Hello, friends. So Andy and I will perhaps take 15 minutes to share a little bit with each other. And during that time, please, if you have any comments or questions, please shape them in your mind, and you can put them in the chat, or even better, it's sort of more immediate and interesting if you'll raise your electronic hand after 15 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation together. Okay. So,
Well, I got to say, Chris, that was all very fascinating. I very much liked hearing your talk. You know, I'd heard the first part of it before, but not the second part about the non-selfing. A lot of overlap between what we said.
yeah,
And-
it's, you know, no, it's not a wonder why, Andy, because you're in my head as we were creating this thing.
But a lot of divergence too.
Oh, well, what kind of points of divergence did you notice?
Well, I'm just always surprised to see just how psychology and Buddhism move in different directions sometimes. You know, yeah, there's a lot of convergence, there's a lot of overlap, and we're emphasizing that. But for example, the thing that stuck out to me was when you started talking about the different selves in the internal family systems and similar things, you know. I mean, in a sense, that's really what the Abhidhamma was doing years ago. Abhidhamma is a kind of evolved psychology that came out of the early texts. You know, they're a little bit later, but not much. And it basically said that, you know, what we reify as a single unified self is actually composed of multiple impersonal parts. And that's the point. These parts are impersonal. So the idea is, you know, just simply anger comes into your mind and it passes away. You know, you are not an angry person, and anger isn't a real thing. It's just something that comes and goes. And if you mindfully observe it coming and going and take an attitude of equanimity towards it, where you're not buying into it, you're not trying to resist it, you're just letting it go, then that depersonalization is really what the whole thing is about.
Yeah.
Now, to take that same idea, which I see echoed in these things, that there are little parts of ourselves that, you know, multiple voices, maybe even, you know, 52 mental factors. But then to immediately say that that now needs to be reified into the self. We've taken the problem of the self and created hundreds of selves. And the same thing with the notion of, you know, there's no separate self. We keep hearing there's no separate self. Why put the word separate in there? Now we've taken the idea of self and created one big self. There's no separate self, but you're part of the big self, you know. And I know there's some Buddhist schools that take that view.
Yeah, so what you said was that anger is, you know, it's probably a convention to say it's a part of us, and then we can let it go. We can recognize that it's a part of us. You know, anger is arising, and we can let it go. So what compassion adds to it, particularly when we work with parts in the way that I was describing, is in order for compassion to arise toward our own experience, we actually need to have a relationship with it. I think I just lost Andy. There we go. No, that's better. Thank you. We actually need to have a relationship with it in order for compassion to arise. So we can feel loving kindness toward anything, but in order to have compassion, there has to be a sentient being. And so the creation of a part, as if it were a little anthropomorphized self or so forth, is actually, I think, skillful means, because it actually brings compassion into mindfulness practice. So we're not just noticing anger and letting it go. We're noticing anger. we're inquiring into anger. We're hearing what the story is that's hearing. We're not valid. We're not reifying. We're hearing what the story is that is associated with the anger, which is frankly a deeper level of engagement that many practitioners don't want to do. And then we're also bringing kindness to that, you might say, bundle of experience that is in that moment revealing and untangling itself. So I think this idea of parts basically is a doorway to bringing compassion into mindfulness practice. And it's also a skillful means, because when we bring kindness to that part of it, we're not just hoping that we have the emotional capacity to turn toward it with curiosity and let it go, which is usually not the case when we've been traumatized or immersed in shame. But we actually are bringing intentional warmth and engagement, which in my view makes it way more easy to turn toward, recognize, linger with, and let go of a difficult experience. So I think I think it's kind of brilliant, skillful means. And ultimately, it's not about reification, because when we ask people, what is the result of this? They say, well, that anger doesn't bother me anymore. I just don't think about it, But one of the ways of thinking about the effectiveness of psychotherapy is when the shoe fits, the foot is forgotten. When the belly fits, the belt, when the belt fits, the belly is forgotten. When we don't think about something anymore, i.e. it's not reified enough to attract our attention, it's gone, And I think when we bring intentional kindness to intense, disturbing, or traumatic events, we're way more likely to let them go. Skillful means.
Yeah, that works.
That works. Anyhow, what I was appreciating when you were talking about, so first of all, let me ask you, did I, create this in my mind after hearing you speak in India, or did you actually say that that a moment of craving or avoidance is out of a moment of craving or avoidance can emerge an entire self?
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
So then that whole structure just kind of goes like this over and over again. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So whatever it takes to dismantle craving or avoidance, one of the things we talk about in self-compassion training a lot is basically resistance, and how mindfulness allows us to be with difficult experience without resistance, which is essentially craving for something other than what we have.
Aversion. Yeah. Well, craving comes in a positive and negative valence.
Yeah.
Positive is the wanting, and negative is the not wanting.
Yeah.
But it's still craving for, craving against. Technically, they say there's three kinds. There's craving for pleasure, or sense pleasure. There's craving for something to become or be. And there's craving for something to stop becoming or not be. Pretty much covers it.
It pretty much covers it, yeah. Yeah. I wrote down a bunch of notes as you were speaking.
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah. Yeah, so one thing you said was, do we need to see ourselves as suffering in order to practice compassion? The answer is yes, but we're not always practicing compassion. Like MSC is not a complete practice. It's a tool that self-compassion is a tool we can use when we're suffering in a particular way. We don't need to look for suffering. It comes to our door quite regularly, but do we have the skills to meet that suffering at the time? I think that's kind of the question. And particularly, do we give ourselves permission to be kind to ourselves, or are we systematically excluding ourselves from the circle of compassion? Self-compassion is ultimately a very humble process, it's basically including ourselves just in the corner of the picture, if anywhere, but excluding does seem to me, Andy, don't you, as a kind of form of selfing? Like, no, not me, no, not me, no, not me. Isn't that selfing?
Yeah, that's aversion at work.
Yeah.
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 So you might be interested to hear, and I don't know what you would do with this information, but according to the more developed Buddhist psychology, when mindfulness occurs, when mindfulness as a mental factor comes up and is functioning in a mind moment, it comes along with 18 other co-arising factors. One of them that comes up with mindfulness is equanimity. So that's why I say every moment of mindfulness is also a moment of equanimity.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that comes up together with those is loving kindness,
Mm-hmm.
is metta. And some people hear that and say, well, wait a minute, that can't be true. That surely loving kindness and equanimity can't coexist. But it's the kind of loving kindness that's equanimous. And it's the kind of equanimity that is benevolent.
Mm-hmm.
And so you touched on this theme multiple times in your talks, how there's an inherent connection between mindfulness, equanimity, and metta, loving kindness. But now the interesting thing is, what's not included in that automatic list is wisdom, compassion, and appreciative joy. Now, I think that appreciative joy and compassion isn't there because, as I suggested earlier, you really need to see somebody that's suffering or somebody that's doing well in order for that to be added on. The other, 20 factors are still there, but this is added on to that. So under some circumstances, there's going to be compassion. Some circumstances are going to be altruistic joy, and presumably they can't coexist in the same moment. But the other part is that you can have all those things and still not be gaining any wisdom. And wisdom builds on that yet farther. So it's like a three-tiered conception of these positive mental factors.
So then wisdom, is wisdom like a different order of mental factor? In other words, is it the accumulation of the other ones, or is it as moment to moment as loving kindness and mindfulness?
It says moment to moment. I mean, that's what's so different between early and later forms of Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
Early Buddhism is radically momentary.
Well, then what does a flash of wisdom look like?
Eureka. I suddenly see how
it all fits together.
Non-self it actually all is.
Okay, yeah.
That, this whole story just unfolded. None of it's personal.
Yeah.
The wisdom builds on the others. You can't have it without the whole supporting crew of mindfulness and all of its buddies, and the compassion or the appreciative joy may or may not be there. Again, that's a special case. But the wisdom, it's a flash. It can come and go quickly, or it can be sustained over multiple moments.
Yeah. So in the MSc program, we bring in wisdom when we talk about gratitude. Because I once had a participant in a group in Switzerland who said to me, Chris, what do you think the texture of gratitude is? The texture of wisdom. Wisdom is so abstract, but if it had texture, what would the texture of wisdom be? And she said it would be gratitude. That's what wisdom feels like, meaning that in a moment of gratitude, you can see the web of interdependence that arises in a given moment, not just what's in front of your nose, but all the threads that you can't see or all the activities that you can't. And that that just breaks your heart open with appreciation. That's gratitude. What do you think about that, Andy? What's the role of gratitude in early Buddhist psychology, and is there any association with wisdom?
Well, the word for gratitude in Pali, the ancient language the Buddha used, was literally translated as knowing what has been done. So gratitude is primarily directed towards one's parents in the classical tradition because you know what they did to take care of you when you were young. It's not its own mental factor. It's not on the sort of deck of or the stage of mental factors in the ordinary way. By and large, I think gratitude is a Western practice that's been grafted onto Buddhism, but it has a place in Buddhism as well, you know. And along those lines, I have to clarify something to our audience here, you know. As I said at the beginning, I'm not a psychologist. I'm a scholar. I'm a curmudgeon, if you will, because all of my inspiration and interest is really on these ancient body of literature, which I find fascinating. But somebody once came to the Buddha and said, well, how do I know what being taught is your teaching or not? And he gave two different answers to two different people. One person, he said, well, I've said everything very carefully and all the texts have been memorized and you can compare sentence by sentence, word by word. And if it's the same, then it's the accurate teaching. And if not, not. But then another person asked him the same question. He says, my teaching mitigates greed, hatred, and delusion. And it promulgates generosity, kindness, and wisdom. Anything that does that is my teaching. And anything that doesn't is not my teaching. So what I mean by that is we've been using the word skillful means. You know, you as a psychologist, all of you, probably many of you are psychologists, are doing really creative and important and helpful work by exercising skillful means. And if something you're doing is helping people and healing people and improving people's situation, then it's the Dharma. That's what the Buddha was teaching, how to help people heal and be better. And so I always try to find the right balance between being really picky about, well, that wasn't in the canon, you know, and at the same time, very expansive. Hey, if that helps, go with it. You know, call it Buddhism. Why not?
Well, I appreciate that blessing from the Buddha via Andy. Thank you for that. And I'm thinking now might also be a really nice time to open the floor to comments and questions by folks on this in this workshop. So if you have anything you would like to share, first we're going to hear from live people if you're willing. If you could, great. So Kim and Jan, both of whom I know. So nice to see you both. We'll first hear from each of you. So Kim from Toronto.
Sure. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Andy, too. I really, really appreciate this as a Buddhist practitioner, but also as an MSc teacher. I'm always trying to...
Oops, Kim, yeah. And also, Fiona, can you spotlight the speaker? That would be really great. There we go, we see you.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Did my earlier words come through?
They did.
Okay. So two things. There was a first question arose, and then I kind of got excited when you were talking about internal family systems, Chris, because in my mind, and I'm not a Buddhist scholar as Andrew is, I have a partner who's a Dharma teacher, so we try to bridge these different cultures by sharing our language and trying to figure out where there are commonalities. But I kind of understand the parts that arise in internal family systems understanding of the self, which is very tangible and obvious when I'm in therapy sessions with people as analogous to the skandhas. You know, they're forms that have, you know, cognitions and emotions and certain kinds of mental activities and certain kinds of consciousness, and actually are not even necessarily human sometimes, and that bridges to my next question, because
Oh, don't go to the next question yet. Let's hear
don't
what
go to the
Andy's
next
got to
question.
say
Yeah,
about that.
well, maybe we can explore that a bit, but it leads into the other question I had, and maybe that's way too much of a stretch or a distortion of Dharma, but in my mind, as I'm trying to understand the very tangible parts that I see arising in MSc teaching and in psychotherapy as kind of analogous to the 5 heaps.
Well, I would put it this way, the 5 heaps are constantly functioning. Every moment they come together and fall apart. And every time they come together, they create a new construction. And most of the time it's a new self. And the self, so the Buddhist teaching of non-self is not that self doesn't get constructed, it does, but that self is as fleeting and as intangible as everything else. And so every single moment is a different self. And if you want to call each moment a person, you can, That's the only part I was objecting to, is adding the personhood. The Buddhists would say it's a different self and it's an impersonal self. And family systems would say it's a different self every moment and each one is a person. It's maybe just a difference in name only, but that's the 2 different perspectives.
That's my intuitive understanding as well, that there's some language differences, but those who were sitting with the experience would see a lot of similarities. At least that's my experience. So I'm appreciative of that. And I'm always, as a Dharma practitioner and as a psychologist, also struggling with this kind of ubiquity of the separative consciousness that arises that creates suffering. And in particular, my heart is drawn to the separative consciousness that is behind polarized situations like war, but also our polarization against the natural world and the environment and our exploitation of it. And I'm really interested in how both Andrew and Christopher, how you would see these understandings giving us guidance in our wise and compassionate response to war and to ecological distress, if you have thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Andy?
I was going to defer to you, but I would say this, from the classical Buddhist point of view, every single problem we face in this world, including and perhaps especially war and environmental disaster, has its roots in the causes of greed, hatred, and delusion. Human beings are being greedy. Human beings are being deluded and hateful. That's why all of that happens. So ultimately, the healing has to be done in our hearts. People have got to be not so nasty and more kind, more nice. And so anybody who's practicing this self-compassion and mindfulness and Buddhism and just common humanity is trying to move the ball in the right direction towards eventual healing from this deep illness, this plague. What did you call it earlier, Chris? Some disease that we have. And all the positive states are contributing to that healing process. But it's a long way to go. But we got to take it step by step, moment by moment. I'm more and more thinking of things not in terms of enlightened persons, but enlightened moments. Any given moment that we can be not craving, but we can be mindful or loving instead, is a momentary victory, a moment of an enlightened mind. And the more of that those we string together, the better for us and the people around us. The more people string those moments together globally, the better off we'll all be.
Yeah, and I might, just extending what Andy's saying, I think to think in terms of enlightened communities, because our problems are global and systemic. And so what does it take? What does it take to reform systems? I think it takes other systems, communities. But one thing I know is that we can organize the most brilliant system, and the history of human civilization kind of fits in that category. And then human beings, if the human heart is basically, if it doesn't have enough compassion in it, we're going to dismantle the system over and over again. So I think we have to basically, each of us can do this, change the human heart as we change the system. In other words, transform ourselves as we reform society and culture. I think we need to do both at the same time. But toward that end, I think what's really important to know is that there's always hope, and there's always hope because we can always change our relationship to whatever the problem is. Last weekend we just completed a conference at Harvard Medical School called Working with Hostility, and we were looking at how contemplative practices and psychotherapy can be the part of the solution and not the problem. And one thing that became clear to me is that each of us can choose how we're going to be. And so much of who we are is context dependent, as Sebane Selassie said, you're not thinking, you think you're thinking your thoughts, you're not, you're thinking culture's thoughts. And so who we are is so inextricably related to the conversation and the culture. And I think that each of us can decide whether we're going to be part of that matrix or not over and over again. It's not a one single decision, but when we decide, then we can, what is it going to be that we decide? So in my view, we can decide to be compassionate in the face of hostility, both fierce compassion and tender compassion. And the easiest way to do that when we're exhausted, as we all are by the news, is self-compassion. We can just fall into compassion. We can notice when it's just unbearable, bring kindness to ourselves, change the internal landscape, and then see what happens.
Thank you so much. I just think this is a very, very important conversation at this time in the world. And I do believe a lot of our current suffering is caused by our misunderstanding of this. So I'm deeply grateful for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah. Jan from Mexico.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. Like Kim said, I highly appreciate. I am also a teacher of mindful self-compassion and practitioner of Buddhism. So the relationship that you are establishing and deepening the practice, I think is wonderful. And a couple of things, the resistance, the working with resistance, less craving, and then maybe mindful self-compassion might erase somehow the illusion of a separate self, I think. But my question really would be maybe to ask Chris or both of you to elaborate more about how mindful self-compassion softens the self. I thought that was a wonderful way of putting it. The mindful self-compassion softens the self. Because the way I see it is that it's like flowing. I guess that we need to flow, enter the stream, right? Something like that.
I would love for you to say a little more. I just love the way you just started to talk about that. Talk about entering the stream as a way of softening the self. Can you do that, Jan?
I may try. I think that we suffer because we hold to things that are not anymore there. So we crave, so we do not flow. We do not move along with life. So like the practices that you teach of affectionate breathing, I think that is to feel life going through me. Like the other day, I was very tired. And at some point, I accepted that I was tired. I stopped struggling with being tired. So somebody told me that that was like, let it flow through you, let it move through your body. The feeling just moves through your body. And somehow, I don't know if I am right, but I associate that. I think it's related to this, what I understand is the Buddhist metaphor of entering the stream. So entering the stream to go with the flow, I think that that's a great inspiration for me. And maybe it also has to do with not reifying, with not sticking to something, but let things just flow, to see myself as a process as opposed to a rigid identity.
Andy, what do you think? Flowing, how does that
It's a
land
wonderful
for you?
metaphor. And yes, it's used in two ways in the Buddhist tradition. One is, a flood that carries you away. That's the flood of desire and ignorance and all that. But the other one is the flow of the stream that carries you naturally to awakening, like a log in the Ganges River going downstream. As long as it doesn't sink or get stuck on a sandbar or whatever, it's going to make it there. So we see that metaphor throughout the Buddhist tradition. On the one hand, there's like, you got to work hard to overcome the toxins and create a better self, so to speak. And on the other hand, you're deeply whole inside, and you just have to let go at a deeper and deeper level and melt into your natural goodness. Both metaphors are there.
Melt into your natural goodness. Wow. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Andy.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you,
Thank you.
Andrew. Annie?
Hi. How do I follow melt into your natural goodness?
Yeah, that's a
And
tough act
there.
to follow.
Beautiful. Yeah, this has been so interesting. And I guess the question I want to ask is about the relationship between compassion and wisdom. And you started to talk about that, or Andy, when you were talking about what happens in moments of mindfulness, that sort of what is understood to be there and not. And so if you could just talk a little bit more about what the sort of early teachings of the relationship between compassion and wisdom. And then I'm also curious, Chris, about where else you see wisdom hiding or emerging from MSc as an MSc teacher. So thank you.
Yeah, well, the earliest tradition was almost all about wisdom, and compassion had a pretty small role. I mean, it was in the Brahma Viharas, but and it permeated as an attitude of caring for life and the welfare of others and so forth, but it wasn't a big part of the teaching. In later Buddhism and Mahayana, it really got elevated significantly, so that wisdom and compassion are seen as co-equal sort of pillars of the entire tradition. And the idea is that they have to be balanced with one another. Like wisdom, like the sword of wisdom that Manjushri carries, is sharp and firm. And sometimes you need to just cut through and be very precise. That's what wisdom can do, cut through the delusions. And then compassion, represented by Avalokiteshvara with 1,000 arms, reaching out to cradle everyone in distress, that clear coldness of wisdom needs to be tempered by the warmth and caring of the hands of compassion. But at the same time, if you're too compassionate without enough wisdom, it's all wishy-washy and you can do more harm than good. So the idea of really these two being fundamental concepts in a balanced view of being a wise human being. And it really did a lot to help the Buddhist tradition get a little bit less severe and heady and more warm and accessible.
Yeah, and in the West, wisdom, well, the Eastern view of wisdom is actually a view, which is to be able to see interdependence, you know, the universality of suffering, selflessness. But the part of the Eastern view that has been transported to the West is an awareness of wisdom as seeing the complexity of any given moment. That's sort of the Eastern side of Western wisdom. And then the Western side of Western wisdom is to see your way through, you know, in other words, pragmatics, like how to do something. You know, people are considered wise if they know how to do things, you know, to work their way through complex situations. Oh, that person's wise, you know? So there are many different views on wisdom. University of Chicago has a kind of a wisdom center. You can get on their website, and it's just extraordinary what's been coming out in the last 10 years in terms of the research on wisdom. But in the MSc program, we assume that, just like Andy's describing, two pillars, two wings of the bird, but we're really mostly focusing on a wing that has been severely neglected, which is the self side of self-compassion. Basically, people have suffered because they've neglected that, and we're just trying to highlight it. That said, when people's compassion starts to arise and they feel then the resources in full bloom, and then they inevitably want to bring it into their daily lives. In other words, okay, so what do I do with my partner? What do I do with my, you know, teenager? What do I do with my boss? What do I do with, and that's ultimately where we say, well, that's a wisdom question, and nobody can say for you what to do because nobody is in your shoes at that time, aware quite as well as you what the different contingencies are. So you are the only one who can actually answer that question, what shall I do? Once we have the resource of compassion burning brightly, we still need to bring in wisdom to know how to work with that compassion. And that's where wisdom in a very practical way comes in the MSc program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's hear from Bob, please.
Hi, gentlemen. Thank you so much for putting this seminar on. I took the seminar with both you and Kristen, and one of the questions I did ask was, how did the self get involved here in regards to the fact that in Buddhism, when we talk about no inherent existence, we also are talking about no self. So my question deals for the most part with what Andrew was talking about at the beginning, where there was no mention of self-compassion with what Buddha was saying. And I thought a little bit about that while we were having the seminar. And as we all know, one of the attributes that makes up the self is perception. And so what we're constantly doing is projecting over appearances or over objects that appear in our space. We put a label on it and we make it real as part of a relationship with the self. So knowing that, and knowing that there's no inherent existence, how can we possibly not have self-compassion when the only thing that truly exists is only us projecting onto basically the world? I would say that maybe only self-compassion exists, and that compassion rolls out of that based on our projections. So that's sort of how I was looking at it. And if you guys want to take a stab at that, that would be great.
Well, I would say you're a living example of what is wisdom and self-compassion.
Oh, thank you.
But I would like Andy to respond.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of subtle thinking there. You know, I like to think of the self as kind of like a baseball game. You know, whether it exists or not can be construed in two different ways. You know, we can take the word to be or to exist as either ontological or process-based. What the Buddhists are saying, as I understand it, is that there's no solid self. The self isn't like you dig in your garden and you come across a great big rock and it's of certain size and shape and you got to work around it and transform it and so forth. But it's more like a baseball game. It's an event. Where is the baseball game? What is the baseball game? It's not a thing. It's a series of carefully orchestrated interdependent events.
Right.
Now, it doesn't exist inherently, but it is enacted. It does occur, even if it doesn't exist. And the Buddhists are saying that everything is like that, not just the self. I mean, the Buddha focused on the psychological dimension of that. The Mahayanist, you know, expanded that to the whole cosmology. But you're right. Just because something doesn't exist as a thing, it still occurs as an event. And that game can be played more or less skillfully. That game can be endlessly interesting and fascinating in all of its nuances. So this great world and life and persons that we are is a fascinating adventure. We just can't take it too seriously or too personally. Everything matters. Everything's important, but nothing matters. That's how I would kind of put it.
So I guess what I hear you saying is, for the most part, that the suffering happens because we get caught up functionally. That if we had the understanding of that there's no inherent existence, that there's nothing more than dependent causes and conditions, we should be able to keep ourselves from grasping and craving, because we know that those things don't exist. But it's when we get caught up in the functionality and we forget, I guess, who we are, that we get ourselves in trouble when we have the existence in the world that we have today.
Yes, yes. And I would further say that, you know, greed and hatred works on one level to create a sense of self, a visceral, driven, emotional self. Mindfulness and equanimity is the antidote to that.
Yeah.
But it also works at the cognitive level, you know, the view of self, thinking about ourselves as selves, that has an effect on the decisions we make and the actions we undertake. And the antidote to that is wisdom. So the self is really addressed in two different ways because it manifests as two different kinds of problems.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good insight. Thank you.
If I could add that when Kristen and I started the MSc program, we got a lot of pushback on self. And we, in particular, when we were at a Tibetan monastery in Scotland, and so we had an audience with Lama Yeshe at this monastery, and we presented our problem. And he laughed. He said, "Oh, just don't call it self-compassion, call it inner compassion. That solves the self problem." So we don't have self and other compassion. We have inner and outer compassion. That, in other words, all directions. It's mostly about compassion. You choose what direction you want to go. But if we just don't use the word, we stay out of trouble. I thought that was brilliant. So there are people like Dan Siegel, who now is really quite interested in self-compassion. And so he only calls it inner compassion to stay out of this problem, you know.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I see a person with the electronic hand up, Andrew, who happens to have the same last name as you. And it would be really great if he could close us out. Nick, love to hear from you.
Pressure. I defer to the elder Olendski for any closing remarks. My question though is, more clinically oriented, and I'll try to put it briefly. How important is it in the process of fostering self-compassion to draw upon prior experiences of having received compassion? Thinking about those clients that might not have had a lot of experiences of that firsthand.
So one thing is very clear, that the way we were treated as children has a huge impact on how self-compassionate we are. So that's usually what we call attachment history. You know, if somebody has secure attachment, they're probably going to have a higher level of self-compassion. Their inner experience was mirrored and received in such a way that the child felt validated and felt good, like I'm good. So whether or not we actually remember experiences of compassion is probably less important than whether, those experiences have accumulated in an almost invisible way that allows us simply to validate and to be kind to ourselves as we were treated. That said, in order to grow in self-compassion, to recall times when we were treated compassionately, does the same thing as asking ourselves, how would I treat a friend? It activates the intention, the orientation, it activates goodwill, such that it's so much easier to include ourselves in that goodwill if we can connect with having been treated compassionately on, consciously. Yeah. So the general principle is whatever it takes to arouse compassion creates a context for self-compassion. And in the MSc program, we are very explicit about the need to create a compassionate community, i.e. in the MSc class, such that people have easier access to compassion for themselves. So that's the general principle. So what you described makes sense. I think you're a therapist now, right, Nick?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Have you played around with this a little bit, asking people to remember a time when they were treated compassionately in order to find more compassion for themselves?
I do, when I think that there might be something to find there. For many people, I ask a similar question of, if you did deeply love yourself, what gift would you give yourself in this moment? Which I really like.
Yeah.
And, often even if somebody does have some sense of harshness towards themselves, they do are able to kind of muster some sense of, well, if I did love myself, this is what I would give myself. And I also very often use what you've been talking about in terms of, what would you tell a best friend, if we just, failed a test, oftentimes, well, I'm stupid, I don't belong here, I should flunk out of school. And oftentimes we don't tell that to our best friend. So.
Well, that's bringing generosity into the picture, which is another wonderful state. And it makes one wonder, why self-compassion? Why not self-appreciative joy? Why not self-equanimity? Why not self-generosity? There may be other ways that we can expand on this. But in your case, Dr. Olendski, it may be that you didn't receive enough compassion growing up to really be able to draw upon that experience.
I was thinking quite the opposite. I thought the reason he has so many brilliant ideas is because it's just, he's flowing, Andrew. Anyhow, thank you so much for your comments.
Thanks, Nick. Great to see you. See, we got matching hairdos.
Yeah, and much gratitude to everybody for spending the last 3 hours with us. I hope it was at least as interesting for you as it was for myself and for Andy. And Andy, I would like to invite you to offer a few last words, and then also Fiona has something to say as well.
All I have to say is to echo what Chris just said. Thank you for your attention, for your interest in this topic, for the work you do in your lives and in the field. And, may we all learn from one another and grow and make ourselves and the world a better place.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for the privilege of teaching with you. Yeah.
Same here, Chris. I appreciate it.
Fiona, anything else we should add?
Yeah, thank you both so much, Chris and Andrew, and everyone who attended tonight. So I dropped this in the chat, but I'll just reiterate. We will send out a follow-up email. You'll see that coming through your inbox in the next few days, and that'll contain the slides that you saw today that several of you requested, the recording of this presentation, and also the continuing education / feedback evaluation. All righty, so that's everything. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks,
Have a great night.
everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.